Hey guys, I'm Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com. Back again for another session of High Power University. And we are still in the trigger subject, and we're really getting into the meat of this trigger subject now, as a lot of us think about it in terms of trigger quality, trigger break weights, and this kind of subject. We're also going to be discussing total length of trigger travel, total length of trigger travel that's required by the design, by the two different types of Sear levers, the Type 1 and the Type 2, or the drop safety Sear lever in the later Mark III or Mark III's and FM 95 models from Argentina included those. So we're going to be covering all of that. It's going to take multiple sessions in order to do that. But one of the ways that I thought would be most interesting would be to conduct part of this whole subject about the trigger in a kind of a case study format. And so here's what we've set up is, and these are pistols that weren't staged for this event so much, but I'm going to give you the background on them. This is an internal extractor high power in our own inventory at BHSpringSolutions LLC, and it's serial number 07459. So that would lead us to believe this is one of the very early high powers made possibly at FN in Belgium. We've refinished it, and it still has the original operating system. Everything here has been cleared multiple times and checked that everything is empty. This has been through our refinish. Turned out pretty nice for such an old high power. Did have quite a bit of metal damage, but anyway, we put all BH springs in this pistol and did very, very minimal refining from that point. And we're going to talk a little bit about the trigger on this particular high power. It has the original operating system, so it's had BH optimized springs. It had a trigger break weight between 7.5 and 8 pounds when we first checked the trigger first scaled the trigger. So okay, we got a trigger pull of about 7.75 pounds, and the trigger travel through the brake on this high power is the trigger moves a lot when it brakes, and then you get even more movement after the slide. The Sear clears the trigger lever, and as I racked the slide there, my finger came back further, and then finally the reset. So the trigger quality, it does have the magazine disconnect in it. We have polished things up quite a bit, and you can tell there's that's pretty decent. This is a brand new out of the box, never fired, completely stock Browning high power practical. You can hear the mechanical kind of grinding sound in that. So we've bettered that in this high power, but the trigger pull is still running us pretty high and pretty consistently around this 7 5/8 kind of a number. And again, that's really still a fairly hefty trigger pull. So, and we don't have any release of the magazine, and so that's another thing that we're going to be needing to address with that handgun. This is an interesting case study right here, and this is going to be a very, very interesting one as we dissect this. This is a Charles Daley high power, one of the only high powers ever marked made in USA. These were made from leftover FEG slide and frame stock that was liquidated after FEG went bankrupt when they did. And this was sent to us. This is a BH Veterans handgun that we have temporarily in our service center, and I snatched it and wanted to do a few things to it. particularly we were struggling with a very high trigger pull. It came in that way, and it was very high with the original trigger subassembly. This is the BH trigger, new advanced trigger subassembly, and we'll go ahead and pull the gauge on this now, and I'll tell you what has been done to get to where it is at this point. And we're still pulling about 7 1/8, 7 1/4. So this one is still running quite high. Real quick, we're going to scale this Browning high power out of the box, and it's breaking right at 7, if that focuses at all. And finally, this is my personal carry high power. It has BH's advanced trigger subassembly in it, and it's breaking right at about 5 pounds. So we are going to jump right into this Charles Daley. Now, I just showed you what the trigger pull was breaking at. Various times today I scaled this, and it ran between about 6 3/4 and about 7 1/4. So, and we're not getting any release of the magazine. We do not have the magazine eject assist spring, which is an option with the new advanced high power trigger. It's not in here, but even if it was, I don't think it would overcome what's holding us up, and we're going to talk about that too. So it's an observation, but we've still got this very, very, very high trigger break weight, considering what we've now put in this handgun, including BH springs, including SFS and new hammer assembly, Sear. We've got the BH advanced trigger. Everything in this trigger has been, I want to show you this. I want to pull to the back of the range of the trigger, just about like that, and it's taking about a little less than 1.5 pounds to pull the trigger fully rearward against the trigger return spring. So we've lightened this, the lightest trigger return spring that we make, and everything here has been polished. The trigger pin's been polished. There's just the trigger lever has been polished. The channel where the trigger lever lives has been polished. Every possible point of resistance, we have polished it, and there's not a lot of resistance being offered by the trigger. The trigger goes up to the Sear lever, and the Sear lever's right here. See the Sear lever? I mean, it's effortless. It's very fluid, floating Sear lever, and there's just nothing as far as resistance on there. So the trigger lever hits here. I did find that originally both triggers, the original trigger subassembly and the BH trigger subassembly, the trigger lever was actually landing right here on the edge of the Sear lever. That would mean your trigger lever is getting too cozy with the side of the channel and the slide. You really want that trigger lever as much as possible to be somewhere around the center of the Sear lever here. It wasn't. The way I go about figuring out where a trigger lever is hitting is to drop some baby powder right there, approximately in that area of the Sear lever, and cover it with baby powder. Keep the slide upside down, slide the frame on, put your slide stop in, pull the trigger, and you'll cause a bare spot on the Sear lever where the trigger lever hit it, and you'll see where the trigger lever is landing. So in order to square that up, you'll be able to see kind of what I did right here. Is it's normal when we fit these Sear levers to file just a bit on this side of the trigger lever. Reason is because that's going to give you a clear pathway to the chamber of the barrel. But on this one, if we can get a focus, this one I came back and filed also on this side of the trigger lever, and it repositions the engagement point more this way, which is what we wanted it to do. And now that trigger lever is really impacting right where we wanted to, right in the middle of the Sear lever. That helped me by about 1/4 pound. It was negligible, just didn't help much at all. So the rest of the trigger pull goes right back to this area right here, the Sear and the hammer tooth, which is located right here. When that Sear lever in the slide gets depressed by the trigger lever, it presses down on this engagement point on the Sear right here. When that presses down, that causes the hammer to clear the Sear, and you have a round fired if there's one in the chamber. So all this, the engagement part here was polished, the hammer tooth was polished. I didn't really consider changing the mainspring. It's the same mainspring where I'm getting this 5 and something pound trigger pull in my carry high power. I don't consider that to be a likely suspect here. This engagement surface here was just polished, I mean like a mirror, and slick as glass. And that helped me by about, again, 1/4 pound. And then we started taking a look at this. This is an area of curiosity for me, and the curiosity mainly has to do with this angle and this angle of the Sear spring to get behind the Sear, and how there is a difference in geometry in this grip frame in terms of what we're seeing in this area. What that's doing is this spring is putting more pressure on this Sear hammer relationship because it's putting more pressure on the Sear, trying to keep the Sear in the position that it is right now, which keeps the hammer back. And what it's doing is it's causing a very slight bow, even though this Sear spring is definitely locked in place. I mean, it's there. It's causing a slight bow in the middle, and it's causing a lot of resistance on the relationship going on right here. So, okay, this is the Type 2 Sear spring. The Type 2 Sear spring has a bend in it right there, and it's different than the optimized version of the Sear spring, which is here. This bend causes more pressure on the Sear and more resistance. By the way, my carry high power, where I was pulling 5 1/8 or 5 1/4, that has the Type 2 Sear spring in it, the more resistance Sear spring. So you see the big disparity of difference, about a 5 pound trigger pull and a 7 pound trigger pull. So I decided to go ahead, we'll put the optimized Sear spring in, but much to my dismay, that did not fix the world. An optimized Sear spring may bring the trigger pull down a little. We'll go ahead and take a look at that and see if it does in the case of this one. And we'll find out right now. And it helped us a little. It got us down to 6 7/8. So we were 7 and something before. Now we put the optimized Sear spring in, and we're down to 6 7/8. But I tell you, that's still very, very unusually high. And I still have this issue of the magazine wanting to stay in the pistol. And it's still, I have, basically at this point, I have nowhere else to go except back to the Sear spring to see if that's what's going to make the difference. And now I'm going to cut to the chase here of where I went with this. I want to just say, as I'm showing you this, this is a exception to every rule that there is about high power Sear springs and these two types of high power Sear springs. Generally, you do not want to make a practice of trying to adjust this spring. In the case of the Charles Daleys, And because of an angular difference that we're finding in the way that the Sear springs install, the only way to bring this Charles Daley into reality was to manually adjust, 1911 style, if you will, the Sear spring, so that instead of the optimized, you see the curve in it, and then you see the one that I've adjusted. Basically what I've done is I've straightened it out more, or gotten it more straightened out instead of and less arced. That's going to apply less pressure on the Sear, and I'm going to show you the effect that happened from that change right now. So we're locked in there. First thing we'll probably note, magazine falls free, and we don't have this bowing effect. Magazine slides in very, very smoothly, not any unusual resistance. And now we'll do a trigger pull break weight test, and we just have a trigger break weight of 5.5 pounds. This Sear spring was adjusted this way several days ago. When you think about it, what I've asked that Sear spring to do is I've asked that Sear spring to now do less work. It would be, I would be much less confident about this approach for getting an acceptable trigger pull. This 5.5 pounds that it's pulling now, that would be right in my wheelhouse as far as for a carry high power. It's not going to be misinterpreted today as a hair trigger, because Glock, that dominates the law enforcement world, advertises their pistols as a 5.5 pound trigger pull. This, in my mind, is now just a beautiful, beautiful trigger pull. But this nuance in this model, you may see the same nuance in other FEG frame stock pistols, and that would be FEGs, that would be Mauser 80 SAs, Karine Mark 1s, and the Charles Daleys. You may encounter this very same thing where, you do everything possible. One thing I did not mention, the Sear relationship with the Sear pin. That also is just, slick as glass. Every resistance point was ruled out before we decided to try to make an alteration or basically weaken the angle on the Sear spring. And in order to get this trigger to be reasonable, and ironically when we did, we also got functional with the magazines leaving the pistol as well. So this is one of those that winds up going a direction that you never kind of see coming, but in the end it's like a little bit like detective work, I guess. Now, one final thing I want to say here, and that is, if you do ever see a true need to modify a Sear spring in a high power pistol, it is important that in the months and years ahead, you keep a constant eye on that trigger break weight, and check it. And if you start to see this decrease, then the Sear spring is losing integrity. I don't think that's likely, because we're asking the spring effectively to do less work, or to do a comparable work that it would be expected to do with the angles that are in play, like in the Browning or FN high powers, that seem to be different enough that it changes the dynamics or the energy exhibited by the same Sear spring, between these handguns and the FN Browning framed high powers. So emphasize, if you make this kind of an adjustment, and this kind of an adjustment in this Charles Daley, in my mind, is very warranted. I'm not a fan of 7.5 pound trigger pulls. Most people aren't. Now this is going to be a much more optimal trigger. This is the high exception to the rule for how you typically approach getting a trigger pull under control in a high power pistol. Basically, you look everywhere possible, and try to handle it everywhere possible before you go to where ultimately you had to go in order to have a functioning pistol that'll let the magazines go. That Sear spring, as you just saw, had to be altered or adjusted in the way that it was. Okay, that ends this session. We really want you to follow along with these case studies in the next several sessions, because these are some really diverse things going on with all of these high powers that we're going to be talking about. This one that I just showed you, this is one of the more strange of the strange in terms of how to get this to a acceptable trigger break weight. Thanks for watching.